The chamber of the alien flagship stretched wide and high like a cathedral built in the void of space. Metal pillars rose like black trees, and strange banners of gold and silver shimmered against the cold glow of the stars outside the massive window walls. The air inside was heavy with authority and the silence of many eyes watching. Hundreds of beings from across the empire stood along the edges of the hall, each waiting to witness the submission of the last stubborn race. The humans had been brought in as prisoners, shackled and led by guards in armor that glowed faintly with shifting patterns of light. Among them walked a man with calm eyes and a steady stride. His clothes were torn from struggle, and his wrists bore the red marks of chains, yet he held himself upright as though the weight of humiliation could not bend him. At the far end of the hall, upon a raised throne of black stone and shining steel, sat the alien commander. She was tall, her frame wrapped in regal armor that looked more ceremonial than practical, yet carried a menace that none could mistake. Her crown-like headpiece shimmered as she leaned forward, eyes narrowing on the humans below. Her voice carried like a blade through the hall, each word precise, sharp, and layered with contempt. She spoke not to the human group as a whole, but to the man who stood at their front, the one who refused to look down even in chains. Her order was clear and absolute. "Bow before me, human," she commanded, her voice echoing through the great chamber. "Bow and know your place beneath the empire that now owns your world." The hall grew still. Every alien guard shifted slightly, waiting for the response. The other humans tensed, their gazes flicking between the soldier and the throne. Submission would mean survival, perhaps a life in chains, but life nonetheless. Defiance could mean death in an instant and punishment for all. Yet the man did not lower his head. He studied the alien commander with the quiet focus of someone who had endured far worse than threats. His silence stretched long enough that some thought he might break, but then he drew in a slow breath and the faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. Without a word he spat on the ground at her feet, the sound sharp and vulgar in the pristine chamber. Gasps swept the hall. The aliens stiffened in disbelief. To spit was not only insult, but desecration in their culture, a defiance more cutting than a blade. The commander rose from her throne, every motion slow with restrained fury. Her eyes blazed and her fingers tightened around the hilt of the ceremonial weapon at her side. She had expected fear, trembling, perhaps even tears, but what she received instead was contempt thrown back at her. In that moment, the human soldier was no longer just a prisoner. He was a challenge. A spark in dry grass. The guards surged forward, weapons raised, ready to cut him down, but the commander raised a hand to halt them. Her pride demanded more than a simple execution. She stepped closer, her armor ringing softly with each stride, until she stood before the human with the full weight of her power looming above him. Her voice, lower now but burning with promise, declared that his insult would not be forgotten, and that his act would bring consequences upon all of his kind. Still the man met her gaze, unflinching, as if daring her to strike him where he stood. The silence stretched again, this time heavier, darker. The other humans looked on with a mix of horror and awe. Some wanted to cry out for him to yield, to beg forgiveness so their lives might be spared, but no words left their mouths. The alien audience whispered among themselves, some shocked, some secretly admiring the audacity of such a fragile creature, refusing to bend before an empire that ruled half the stars. In their hearts, a seed of doubt was planted. If one man could spit in the face of power without fear, then perhaps humans were not as weak as they seemed. The commander finally turned her gaze from the soldier and swept her eyes across the assembly. Her voice boomed, declaring that humanity would pay dearly for this insult, that the empire would remind them of their lowly place, and that defiance would be crushed not just in this hall, but across every corner of the galaxy where humans still dared to resist. She raised her hand and ordered the guards to drag the prisoners back to the holding cells. The soldier was yanked away, yet even as the chains rattled and he was shoved forward, he walked with the same upright posture, head unbowed, eyes steady as if he had won something far greater than freedom. When the doors closed behind them, hall erupted in a storm of voices. Some demanded immediate execution, others urged caution, fearing that such a defiant act might inspire unrest. The commander returned to her throne, but her pride had been scarred, and that wound demanded retribution. In her mind, the human was no longer just a nameless prisoner. He was a symbol of defiance, a reminder that even the smallest ember could grow into fire if left unchecked. She swore that he would be broken before the eyes of his people, and that all humanity would learn what it meant to stand against the Empire. Yet beyond the steel walls of the flagship, whispers began to spread. Word traveled faster than any guard could silence. Tales of the human who refused to bow carried through the ranks of slaves and prisoners, then through smugglers and traitors, until soon the story was moving across systems like wildfire. For the first time in years, hope stirred in human hearts. Perhaps they were not finished, perhaps chains could be broken, perhaps all it took was one act of defiance to remind them of who they truly were. And in the heart of the alien commander's ship, a soldier sat in chains but smiled in the dark, knowing his refusal had already shaken an empire. The soldier was dragged back through the long corridors of the alien flagship, his wrists bound in heavy chains and his steps forced forward by the sharp prods of the guards. The hallways were alive with whispers and sideways glances as news of his defiance spread faster than the guards could contain it. Every prisoner who caught a glimpse of him seemed to straighten their backs. Every alien who passed by carried the same look of disbelief. No one had ever spat upon the commander's feet and lived to tell of it. Yet this man had done so, and still breathed. He was thrown into a cold cell, where the walls hummed faintly with energy fields that cut off any chance of escape. Other humans in the chamber looked at him with a mixture of awe and fear. Some asked him in hushed voices why he had not bowed, why he had risked their lives with a single act of defiance. But he only looked at them with calm eyes and answered that there was no survival in chains. There was only living like cattle, and he would rather die on his feet than kneel to arrogance. His words spread through the prisoners like fire through dry grass. For years they had whispered of freedom, but always in secret, always in fear. And now one man had stood in open defiance before the highest power and reminded them of their strength. Guards outside the cell spoke in their own tongue, their voices sharp with nervous tones. Some wanted him executed at once. Others believed the commander had plans for him, and they dared not interfere. In the great halls of the ship, the council of alien officers gathered around the commander, their faces grim and their voices heavy with debate. Many urged her to destroy the humans before the spark of rebellion grew. Others argued that executing the soldier might make him a martyr and give his people even greater resolve. The commander listened to their words, but her pride burned hotter than their caution. She declared that the insult could not be ignored and that humanity would face punishment severe enough to erase all thoughts of resistance. Yet outside the flagship, news traveled far beyond her control. Traitors who had been present in the grand chamber carried tales back to their ships. Some spoke of the madness of the human who spat upon power itself. Others carried the story with admiration, their voices hushed but their eyes bright. The story reached human colonies still struggling under alien patrols. It reached secret cells of resistance fighters hiding in the ruins of old cities. It reached families who had long lost hope of freedom. And with every telling, the soldier's act grew larger than life. He was no longer just a man in chains. He became a symbol of what it meant to be human, a reminder that they had once defied empires and built their own place among the stars. The alien rulers noticed the change quickly. In villages where humans were forced to work as laborers, there was a shift in their eyes. They moved with more purpose, they spoke with more courage, and they began to whisper openly where once they were silent. Patrols reported growing unrest. More resistance, more hidden weapons, more refusal to obey. The Empire had hoped fear would keep humanity docile, but fear was crumbling, replaced by the dangerous fire of hope. The soldier himself remained in the cell, silent and calm, though deep within he carried the weight of what he had started. He had not planned to become a symbol, had not asked for it, yet he could hear the whispers around him and see the way other prisoners looked at him now. Where once they had been broken, now they carried light in their eyes. He understood then that his act was no longer his alone. It belonged to all of humanity, and whatever fate awaited him would shape the future of his kind. Meanwhile, the commander prepared her response. She gathered fleets, issued orders, and made plans to stamp out every ember of resistance before it grew into a flame. She spoke of the human soldier with venom, vowing to break him before his people and to show them that defiance only led to ruin. Yet among her own officers there were cracks forming. Some saw the humans' courage and wondered if perhaps they had underestimated the species. Others worried that the commander's obsession would drive them into a costly war. Whispers spread even among the ranks of the Empire, though none dared speak too loudly within her reach. In hidden places far from the flagship, resistance leaders began to speak his name. They shared the story again and again, using it to rally fighters who had long been afraid. They painted the walls of ruins with marks of defiance, carved symbols of unbowed humanity into stone and steel, and swore that they would never kneel again. Small skirmishes began to erupt across occupied zones. Human fighters struck at patrols, stole weapons, and vanished into the shadows before reinforcements could arrive. It was not yet war, but it was a storm gathering on the horizon. One night, within the dark cell of the flagship, the soldier sat against the wall and closed his eyes. The hum of the energy fields was steady. The footsteps of guards echoed faintly down the corridor, but within the silence he thought of Earth. He remembered the wide fields of green, the scent of rain on soil, the voices of children playing in streets now burned by alien fire. He carried those memories like armor, and he knew that even if chains bound his wrists, his spirit could not be shackled. He whispered to himself that freedom was worth any price, and though no one else heard him, the walls seemed to hold the words. The next morning he was dragged once more before the commander, not to kneel but to be displayed before her officers. She stood tall, her gaze sharp and her voice colder than ice as she declared that his defiance had already stirred rebellion, and that the punishment would be swift and merciless. She told him that his people would be broken, that every act of resistance would be crushed, and that he would live to see their despair before his own death. Yet he looked at her with steady eyes and answered only that humanity would never kneel. Not to her, not to any empire. The hall fell silent again. The officers shifted uncomfortably. The commander's fury deepened, yet something in her gaze betrayed unease. She had expected a man trembling in fear, but instead she faced a spirit that no chains could bind. And in the silence of that hall, the future began to shape itself, for the refusal of one man had already changed the destiny of a species, and soon it would change the fate of an empire. The commander did not rest after the defiance she had witnessed. Her pride was wounded and her authority questioned, and in her empire, such things could not be allowed to linger. She called together her officers in the war chamber of the flagship. The chamber was a wide circular hall filled with glowing maps of star systems, red and blue lights shifting across the air as fleets were marked and territories displayed. She stood in the center with her cloak sweeping across the metallic floor and her voice sharp as she demanded action. She ordered fleets to be moved closer to the human colonies. She commanded raids to begin against known pockets of resistance. and she declared that the soldier who had spat upon her honor would be paraded before his people, as proof of their weakness before he was finally executed. Many of her officers agreed loudly, eager to please her, but not all. A few exchanged uneasy glances and spoke with careful words. They warned that the human act of defiance had already begun to spread. Reports from patrols showed unrest growing faster than expected. Human laborers were refusing orders, secret gatherings were forming, and patrols were being ambushed in rural areas. The officers feared that harsh punishment might only feed the flames of rebellion. But the commander's eyes burned with fury, and she dismissed their worries. She believed fear would crush hope as it always had, and she would make sure fear returned in greater force than ever. While she prepared her answer, the soldier remained in the cell deep within the flagship. The chains on his wrists were heavier now, the guards more watchful, but the silence between the prisoners was gone. They spoke to one another in whispers of rebellion, of family still alive on distant worlds, of the chance that freedom was not a dream but something worth fighting for. They looked to the soldier not as a prisoner like themselves, but as a leader, though he had no title and gave no orders. His very presence was enough. His calm gaze and unbroken spirit reminded them daily that even in the heart of the enemy's flagship, they were not beaten that far beyond the flagship. Hidden human resistance groups were moving. In burned cities on Earth, in tunnels under colonies, and in forests of forgotten worlds, men and women gathered weapons scavenged from battlefields. They listened to the story of the soldier who would not bow. They told it to their children, who repeated it in play as though it were already legend. Leaders of resistance cells began to unite under this symbol. For years they had been divided, striking small blows but never forming a true force. Now they found common ground. If one human could defy the most powerful commander of the empire, then surely together they could rise. Skirmishes increased. Patrols vanished in the night. Supply ships were raided by fighters who appeared from nowhere and vanished back into the void. The empire grew restless. What had been a single insult in a single hall was becoming a wave across the stars. The commander returned often to the prison chamber where the soldier was held. She would stand before him with cold fury, speaking of the destruction his defiance had caused. She told him that his people would suffer because of him, that whole colonies would burn for his pride. She waited for fear in his eyes, but it never came. He listened in silence, and when she demanded a reply, he said only that humanity had always been slow to rise, but once awake it could not be stopped. His words echoed in her mind like an unwelcome truth, and though she outwardly scoffed, in the shadows of her thoughts a sliver of doubt formed. Meanwhile, resistance leaders found ways to smuggle messages into the very flagship where the soldier was held. A guard sympathetic to their cause slipped a small piece of metal into the cell, a symbol carved with the mark of rebellion. When the soldier saw it, he closed his fist around it and for the first time allowed himself a smile. It was proof that humanity was not waiting quietly for its doom. The fight had already begun, and he had become its heart. Back in the Empire Council chambers, debate grew heated. Some rulers demanded the extermination of humanity before the fires spread further. Others argued that the Empire had faced rebellions before and crushed them with ease, and they would do so again. Yet whispers of caution continued. The humans were different, some said. They were not strong in body compared to many species, yet their will was unshakable, their creativity dangerous, and their unity growing. The story of the soldier was reaching beyond humans alone. Even among other conquered races, there were murmurs of admiration. To spit in the face of the empire was unthinkable, yet the human had done so and lived. If humans could resist, why could not others? The commander did not care for whispers. She prepared her fleet and sent orders to burn villages where rebellion had been found. She wanted to crush hope quickly, to show that resistance brought only death. Yet every act of violence seemed to strengthen human resolve. For every village destroyed, 2 more rose in secret. For every fighter killed, more joined the cause. The empire found itself chasing shadows and striking harder but gaining less. One night the soldier lay, awake in his cell while the hum of the ship surrounded him. He thought of his home world, of the cities now turned into fortresses of the empire, of the skies filled with alien warships. He thought of the voices he had heard among the prisoners, voices that now carried hope instead of despair. He felt the weight of their expectations, but he did not fear it. He accepted it as the burden of defiance. If he was to be the symbol, then he would carry it fully, for he believed that freedom was worth the cost of his life. The commander too lay awake in her private chamber, her mind restless. She replayed the moment of defiance again and again. The spit at her feet, the calm eyes that had never wavered. She longed for his execution, yet some instinct kept her from it. She wanted him broken publicly, humiliated before his people, destroyed in a way that would erase the story of his courage. But she could not erase the truth of what he had already done. The empire itself felt the tremor dot, and so the tension grew. With every passing day, the soldier in chains became a beacon. The humans across worlds became restless and bold. The commander became obsessed with crushing them. The empire's allies began to watch carefully, wondering if perhaps a shift in power was coming. The stars themselves seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the moment when words and whispers would no longer be enough, when sparks would become flames, when the quiet resistance would turn into open war. The first true strike of humanity came, not from the great fleets or armies, but from a handful of rebels who carried nothing more than courage and stolen weapons. In the darkness of a mining colony on the edge of the empire, human fighters emerged from tunnels and shadows to ambush an alien supply convoy. The battle was brief but fierce, and for the first time since their defeat, the humans stood over the wreckage of enemy machines and claimed victory. Word of this spread faster than light. It leapt from world to world, carried by smugglers, whispered by slaves, shouted by rebels. The empire tried to cover the loss, but truth is harder to bury than corpses. And soon all knew that humans had struck back. In her flagship the commander seethed. Reports arrived of burned patrols, vanished officers, sabotaged ships. She demanded more soldiers, more weapons, more fleets to crush this rebellion. She declared that it was no longer a matter of punishment, but of war. The soldier in chains was brought once more before her, forced to his knees though his body resisted even the weight of chains. She told him that his people had begun a war they could not win, that their courage was foolishness, and that his act of spitting had cost thousands of lives. Yet he looked at her with the same calm eyes and answered that courage was not foolishness, and that freedom was worth more than life itself. His words enraged her further, but among her officers some remained silent, for deep in their minds they wondered if perhaps he was right. On Earth itself, the fires of rebellion began to blaze openly. Resistance groups rose from the ruins of old cities. They struck at alien garrisons, cutting supply lines, destroying watchtowers, freeing prisoners. The Empire struck back with brutality, sending warships to rain fire upon towns that dared defy them, yet every strike seemed to strengthen human resolve. The sight of burning homes did not break them, but hardened them. Families that had once hidden in fear now joined the fight, willing to risk all for a chance at freedom. The soldier's name became a rallying cry, though few knew his real name. To them he was the unbowed, the one who had stood tall when chains pressed upon him. Songs were whispered about him in dark corners, and children learned the story before they could even walk. He was no longer just a man in a cell. He had become the fire of humanity. The commander prepared her grand move. She gathered a fleet larger than any before, and sent it to crush a major human resistance stronghold hidden in the mountains of a colony world. She swore that the rebels would be wiped out, that the story of the unbowed soldier would end in ashes, and that humanity would bow once more or perish. Yet the humans had prepared. Guided by unity they had not known in years, they set traps, mined the mountains, and lured the enemy into narrow passes where large ships could not maneuver. When the fleet descended, expecting to sweep the ground clean, they were met with explosions that shattered the earth and fire that tore through the sky. The battle was chaos. Human fighters rushed from caves and forests, striking swiftly and disappearing before heavy weapons could find them. Alien soldiers, trained for order and discipline, found themselves overwhelmed by an enemy that refused to fight on their terms. Losses mounted, and though the humans suffered greatly, the Empire suffered more. For the first time in centuries, the commander's fleet withdrew from a battle against what they had considered a primitive species. It was a retreat born not of strategy but of necessity, and when news of it spread, the galaxy trembled inside. Her flagship, the commander, raged, smashing her hand against the war table, shouting at her officers, vowing that she would personally see the unbowed soldier destroyed. She could not bear the shame of retreat, and worse than shame was the realization that fear was slipping from her grasp. Her empire had ruled through fear, but fear was dying. Hope was replacing it, and hope was far more dangerous. The soldier, still bound in chains, was not told of the retreat. Yet he knew something had changed. The guards walked more stiffly, the officers avoided his gaze, and the air of absolute control seemed thinner. When whispers reached him that humanity had won a great battle, he closed his eyes and breathed deeply. He felt the chains on his wrists, but in his heart he was already free. Across the stars, other species watched carefully. Many had been conquered by the Empire long ago, their wills broken, their spirits subdued. Yet now they whispered of humans, of their courage, of their refusal to bow. Some began to wonder if they too could rise, if the Empire could be resisted. Seeds of unrest spread, far wider than the commander had ever imagined. Her war against humanity was becoming a war against doubt itself, and doubt was a poison that could not be easily purged. The humans meanwhile prepared for more. Leaders from different cells gathered in secret meetings to form something greater than scattered resistance. They spoke of a united fleet, of building ships from stolen parts, of turning captured weapons against their oppressors. They spoke of freedom not as a dream, but as a plan. And through it all they carried the story of the unbowed soldier, their symbol, their fire. The commander tightened her grip. She demanded spies to track every whisper, execution of anyone suspected of aiding humans, destruction of every village that refused tribute. Yet such cruelty only deepened hatred. The more she struck, the stronger humans became, and the more the galaxy began to see her not as an unshakable ruler but as a desperate tyrant. The soldier was visited once more by the commander herself. She entered his cell without guards, her eyes filled with fury. She told him that his people had drawn her into war, that they would suffer as no species had ever suffered, and that she would see him broken before it ended. He looked at her in the dim light of the cell, his voice steady as he told her that war was not born of his act but of her arrogance, and that the Empire itself had sown the seeds of its fall. His words cut into her pride like a blade. She left without reply, but the silence of her departure spoke louder than her fury. The spark had become flame. The first true battle had been fought, and though the humans were scarred and bloodied, they were unbroken. The commander prepared her fleets for greater war, but humanity was ready now. They were no longer scattered, no longer divided, no longer silent. They were awake, and their defiance echoed through every star system touched by the Empire. The war had begun. The war had spread across the stars like a fire that could not be contained. What began with whispers in dark cells and hidden villages had grown into fleets of human ships rising from shipyards, built in secret. Old freighters were reforged into war machines, stolen weapons were welded into new designs, and men and women who had once lived only under chains now stood together in defiance. The Empire struck again and again, burning worlds and sending legions. Yet everywhere they went, they faced resistance fiercer than before. Humanity was no longer fighting only for survival, but for freedom, and freedom gave them strength that no calculation could measure. The commander gathered the greatest fleet her empire had ever seen. Hundreds of warships filled the void of space around her flagship, their hulls gleaming in the light of distant stars. She swore before her council that this would be the battle to end the rebellion forever, that humanity would be erased or broken so completely that no trace of resistance would remain. Her eyes burned with hatred and pride, and though some of her officers still whispered doubts, none dared oppose her openly. The human leaders knew the storm was coming. They met in hidden stations orbiting barren moons, their faces worn from struggle, yet alight with determination. They spoke of their losses, of families destroyed and homes turned to ash, but they also spoke of victories and the chance to shape a future where their children could live free. At the center of every speech and every plan stood the story of the soldier who had refused to bow. They knew he was still in chains aboard the enemy flagship, yet to them, he was already a leader, a living banner under which they fought. The day came when the two fleets met. In the emptiness near a dying star, human ships emerged from hidden jump routes, ragged and mismatched yet burning with purpose. The Empire fleet loomed before them, massive and organized, a wall of steel and firepower. Between them stretched the silence of space, broken only by the anticipation of what was about to begin. The commander stood upon her bridge, her voice cold and steady as she ordered the advance. She promised her crew that the humans would be crushed like insects beneath her heel. The first shots lit the void. Energy beams cut across the darkness, missiles streaked, ships collided in deadly arcs of fire. The Empire expected a swift collapse, yet the humans fought with a fury that defied every prediction. Their ships darted between larger war vessels, striking at weak points, sacrificing themselves to take down giants. Every loss was answered with greater ferocity. In the chaos of the battle, the commander realized that she was not fighting numbers but will, and will could not be measured on any map. Amid the thunder of war, the soldier remained in his cell, the walls shaking with every blast that struck the flagship. Guards rushed through corridors, alarms blared, and the ship trembled under assault. A hidden ally among the crew, one who had been touched by the story of his defiance, unlocked his chains and opened his cell. The soldier stepped into the corridor with wrists raw from years of bonds yet spirit unbroken. He took a weapon from the fallen guard and moved through the chaos with purpose. His goal was not escape. His goal was the commander. The battle outside raged as human ships pressed closer to the flagship. They knew that cutting off the head of the Empire's army could end the war in a single stroke. Boarding craft smashed against the hull, and human fighters poured into the corridors, clashing with alien soldiers in brutal combat. The soldier moved among them, guiding them through the twisting passages, his calm voice steady even in the storm of violence. For those who fought beside him, it felt as though the legend had stepped from story into flesh. At last he reached the throne chamber, where it had all begun. The commander awaited him there, her armor gleaming, her blade drawn, her pride unshaken even as her fleet faltered. She looked upon him with a mixture of fury and grim respect. She told him that he had defied her once and sparked a war that had consumed thousands of lives, and now he would die by her hand. He answered simply that he had not sparked war, he had only refused to bow, and that it was her arrogance that had brought ruin upon her empire. They clashed in the center of the Chamber, her blade sweeping with power, his stolen weapon striking with desperate skill. Around them the battle roared as humans and aliens fought, but all eyes fell upon the two figures locked in combat. She was taller, stronger, armed with the finest weapon of her empire, yet he fought with the strength of conviction. Each strike was driven not by hatred, but by the unyielding belief that humanity would never be broken. The fight raged until at last his weapon struck true. The commander fell upon the steps of her throne, her eyes wide with disbelief. The chamber grew silent. Her officers watched in shock as the soldier stood over her, battered but unbowed. He did not raise his voice in triumph, for victory was not his alone. He simply looked upon her fallen form and declared that humanity would never kneel again. News of her defeat spread faster than the battle itself. The Empire fleet faltered, their will shattered without their commander. Human ships pressed the attack, and soon the vast fleet that had come to rebellion broke apart in retreat. The galaxy watched in awe as the empire that had seemed eternal was forced to yield ground before the species it had once called weak. When the battle ended, the soldier did not claim a crown or title. He returned to his people scarred and weary, but with eyes that still held the same calm fire. He stood before the united human leaders and told them that freedom was not a gift but a burden, that they must carry it with strength and unity or risk losing it again. His words became the foundation of a new beginning. On Earth the ruins of cities slowly began to heal. Families rebuilt homes, children played once more beneath open skies, and the memory of chains became a warning rather than a fate. Across the colonies, humans worked side by side to shape a future not ruled by fear. The soldier's story was told in every corner, not as legend alone but as truth, a reminder of what defiance could achieve. Other species watched and learned. Some rose against their oppressors, inspired by the tale of the unbowed. The empire that had ruled through fear began to fracture, its grip weakened by the flame humanity had lit. The galaxy shifted, and the balance of power changed forever. And so the war ended not with the destruction of humanity, but with its rebirth. One act of defiance had sparked a fire that spread beyond chains, beyond fear, beyond the limits of one world. The soldier who had spat at arrogance became the symbol of a people who would never bow again. His legacy was not war alone, but freedom. And that legacy would guide humanity through the stars for generations to come. The end.